As we move deeper into the book of Psalms, we come to a category that many believers find both uncomfortable and deeply comforting: the Psalms of Lament. These psalms remind us that faith does not silence pain. Instead, faith gives pain a place to speak. Lament is the language of those who believe in God, but are struggling to understand what He is doing. It is the prayer of a heart that refuses to walk away, even when answers feel absent. In the ancient world of Israel, lament was not seen as weakness or spiritual failure. It was an accepted and necessary part of worship. Life in biblical times was filled with uncertainty. War, disease, famine, exile, injustice, and loss were common realities. The people of God needed words to cry out when life did not make sense, and God gave them those words through the Psalms. Lament allowed individuals and the community to bring suffering into God's presence, rather than carrying it alone. Psalm 13 is one of the clearest examples of personal lament. David begins with a raw question that many believers have whispered in their own hearts: "How long, O Lord?" This question appears repeatedly in Scripture and reflects prolonged suffering rather than a momentary struggle. This psalm likely emerged during a season when David felt abandoned, possibly while fleeing from Saul or facing ongoing opposition. What is striking is that David does not pretend to feel confident at the beginning. He expresses despair, fear, and emotional exhaustion. Yet within just a few verses, the psalm turns. David chooses to trust in God's steadfast love and ends with praise. This movement teaches us that lament is not about staying in despair, but about bringing despair honestly to God and allowing trust to re-emerge over time. Psalm 22 takes lament even deeper. These words, later spoken by Jesus on the cross, express profound abandonment and suffering. This psalm reflects an individual experiencing intense distress, possibly surrounded by enemies and public humiliation. The imagery is vivid and painful, capturing physical, emotional, and spiritual agony. Yet even here, the psalm does not abandon faith. The sufferer continues to address God, remembering His faithfulness to past generations. The shift from suffering to hope later in the psalm reveals an important truth. Lament can coexist with confidence. Faith does not deny pain, but it refuses to believe pain is the final word. Psalm 42 reflects a different kind of lament: spiritual dryness and longing for God's presence. The psalmist speaks of tears as constant companions and describes the soul as downcast and disturbed. This psalm may come from a Levite who was separated from the temple, possibly during exile or displacement. For someone whose identity was rooted in worship, being far from the place of God's presence felt devastating. This lament teaches us that distance from familiar spiritual rhythms can deeply affect our faith. Yet the psalmist speaks to his own soul, reminding it to hope in God. Lament here becomes an internal dialogue, a way of holding faith together when emotions threaten to pull it apart. Psalm 88 stands apart from many other laments because it does not resolve neatly. It ends in darkness, without an obvious turn toward praise. This psalm reflects severe suffering, possibly prolonged illness or social isolation. Its inclusion in Scripture is deeply significant. It tells us that God allows space for unresolved pain. Not every prayer ends with immediate relief. Not every season concludes with visible restoration. Yet the psalm itself is still a prayer. The writer continues to speak to God, even when hope feels faint. This teaches us that faith is sometimes simply continuing to pray, when there are no easy answers. Together, these Psalms of Lament reveal that God welcomes honest pain. He does not require his people to sanitize their prayers or hide their grief. Lament allowed Israel to process national disasters, personal losses, and spiritual confusion without abandoning their covenant relationship with God. Lament kept the conversation with God open during seasons when silence might have seemed easier. The key teaching of lament is that it is not a lack of faith, but faith expressed. Complaining about God is different from complaining to God. Lament chooses relationship over resignation. It brings questions, anger, fear, and sorrow directly to the one who can bear them. In doing so, it acknowledges that God is still present, still listening, and still worthy of being addressed, even in pain. This understanding reshapes how we view prayer today. Many believers feel pressure to sound strong or hopeful, even when they are breaking inside. The Psalms remind us that biblical faith includes tears, confusion, and protest. Jesus himself prayed the language of lament, showing us that expressing suffering before God is not sinful, it is sacred. On the cross, his cry from Psalm 22 revealed trust in the Father even in the deepest suffering. These Psalms call us to turn pain into prayer. Rather than suppressing grief or pretending everything is fine, lament invites us to name our pain honestly before God. This does not mean we dwell endlessly on suffering, but that we bring it into God's presence, where healing can begin. In ancient times, Israel practiced lamenting publicly and privately, allowing grief to be shared rather than hidden. In the same way, prayerful lament today can open the door to healing, community, and renewed hope. Lament also teaches us patience. Many of these psalms reflect long seasons of waiting. Faith is not always instant victory. Sometimes it is endurance. When we lament, we are acknowledging that we do not yet see the full picture, but we trust God enough to keep speaking to Him while we wait. As we reflect on the Psalms of Lament, we learn that God is not distant from our suffering. He is near to the brokenhearted, attentive to every cry, and present in the silence as much as in the psalm. Lament reminds us that prayer is not about saying the right words, but about bringing our true selves before God. In doing so, pain is not wasted. It becomes a pathway to deeper trust, deeper honesty, and a more resilient faith. Through lament, we discover that God does not turn away from our tears. He meets us in them. We will see again and again that even the darkest prayers are held within the faithful hands of a God who listens, remembers, and ultimately restores. As we sit longer with the Psalms of Lament, we begin to see that they follow a recognizable pattern, one that shaped Israel's prayer life and can still guide ours today. Many laments begin with an address to God, followed by a complaint, a request for help, and in some cases, an expression of trust or hope. This structure shows us that lament is not chaotic despair, but a disciplined form of prayer. Even when emotions feel overwhelming, lament gives them direction. It keeps pain aimed toward God rather than turned inward or outward in destructive ways. Communal laments were especially important during times of national crisis. When Jerusalem was threatened, when crops failed, or when the people were taken into exile, lament allowed the nation to cry out together. These prayers acknowledged loss without pretending everything was fine. They also reinforced the belief that God was still sovereign, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Lament helped Israel survive seasons that could have shattered their identity as God's people. Personal laments functioned in much the same way on an individual level. David's prayers show us a man who was emotionally honest, yet spiritually anchored. He did not hide fear, anger, or confusion, but he also did not let those emotions define his relationship with God. By bringing his pain into prayer, David allowed suffering to deepen, rather than destroy his faith. This teaches us that spiritual maturity is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to bring struggle before God. Psalm 42 reveals another important dimension of lament, memory. The psalmist recalls past worship experiences as a way of holding on to hope. In Israel's culture, remembering was a spiritual discipline. Recalling what God had done before became a lifeline during present distress. Lament often looks backward in order to survive the present. It clings to past faithfulness while waiting for future deliverance. Psalm 88 challenges modern expectations of prayer perhaps more than any other psalm. It shows us that unresolved suffering still belongs in God's presence. The absence of resolution does not mean the absence of faith. This psalm gave language to those whose suffering did not end quickly or neatly. Its presence in Scripture assures us that God values honesty over closure. Faith sometimes looks like continuing to speak to God in the dark. The Psalms of Lament also prepare us to understand the cross more deeply. When Jesus cried out from Psalm 22, he stepped fully into Israel's tradition of lament. He entered human suffering not as an observer, but as a participant. This moment shows us that lament is not only something God permits, it is something God Himself has entered into. The cross confirms that God is not distant from pain, but intimately acquainted with it. This truth reshapes how we respond to suffering in our own lives. Lament teaches us to resist shallow optimism and spiritual avoidance. Instead of rushing to solutions or forcing praise prematurely, lament allows grief to be acknowledged and honored. It gives us permission to slow down, to sit with God in the tension, and to trust that He is at work even when we cannot see it. Turning pain into prayer also changes how we walk with others. When lament is part of our faith language, we become better companions to those who are hurting. We learn to listen without fixing, to pray without minimizing, and to hope without pressuring. The people of Israel lamented together, sharing both sorrow and trust. In the same way, the church is called to be a community where tears are welcomed and faith is nurtured gently. Over time, lament reshapes our understanding of God. It teaches us that God is strong enough to handle our hardest questions and kind enough to stay near in our pain. Lament keeps the relationship alive when circumstances threaten to silence prayer altogether. It is an act of courage, choosing connection over isolation. As we continue through the book of Psalms, the Psalms of Lament remind us that suffering does not disqualify us from God's presence. On the contrary, it often becomes the very place where God meets us most deeply. When we cry out honestly, we are not pushing God away, we are drawing near. And in that space of honest prayer, faith is not destroyed, it is refined.